special music this morning, so that gives me a couple more minutes. Glad to see everybody here today. When I was working on my last sermon way back in April, I was going to enter Esther, but as I started reading it, there's so much in that story that most of us just go right over. You know, the little stories that we heard as children's tells us maybe a quarter of the whole story. So I decided to use it, so I saved it for a later date, which is today. I'll give you a little background right now. The Jews had been taken captive. Those who were not killed had been taken in. A lot of them were taken into Babylon. Now Cyrus had allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, but only about 50,000 of them actually did so, in comparison to the hundreds of thousands scattered throughout the provinces of Medo-Persia. The thought of rebuilding desolate cities was too much a hardship for them to handle. 20 or so years later, Darius Histispes gave another edict allowing the Jews to return. This edict was similar to the first one. The prophet Zechariah pleads for their return. Zechariah 2, verses 6 through 9. Ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north. I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heaven, saith the Lord. Deliver thyself, O Zion, that dwellest in the daughter of Babylon. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath he set me unto the nations which spoiled you. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. For behold, I will shake mine hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil in their servants, and ye shall know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me. Again, not many returned. Thus the setting for the Jews here at the time of Esther. In your Bibles, if you turn to Esther, you'll see a king named Ahasuerus. That is the Hebrew name. His Persian name was Xerxes. Most of the translations of the Bible say Ahasuerus. The New International Version uses Xerxes. Mrs. White in her writings uses them both. I will be using the New International Version today, and I will be using the term Xerxes because it's a little easier to pronounce. Okay, let's start with Esther 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned in his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The Persians were known for two or three things. Number one is lavish banquets. Number two, heavy drinking. And number three is they had a very efficient postal system back in those days. In the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles and the provinces were present. For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. Now this was mainly for the people that were in charge of putting on the first banquet, the long one. These were the people that were in the citadel. In the enclosed garden in the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each other what he had wished. Some people think that the book of Esther really shouldn't even be in the Bible. There's no mention of God in the book whatsoever. The only thing is Esther asked for the 3 days for Mordecai to pull the Jews together for 3 days of fasting and prayer. And that's it. So some people thought that it really shouldn't be there, but it is, and there's valuable lessons for us. Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes, the auxiliary. On the seventh day, now this is the second banquet, on the seventh day when King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty. For to the people and the nobles, she was easy on the eyes. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. When the king became furious and he burned with anger. Okay, now, in the Bible commentary, when talking about these verses, it says that her refusal was for the king's good. She knew how the king would think and act once he sobered up. Now, I was born into a Seventh-day Adventist family, and I'm 62 years old. And I can say that I could probably almost hold my breath for as much time as I've been around anybody that's been drunk or inebriated. Many of us are going to witness a wedding tomorrow, Megan and Jason. And fortunately for Megan, I think she's going to be in that same boat because she's into a family where alcohol just isn't a part of our lives. And we can thank God for that. Vashti she thought she knew how the king would act and think once he sobered up. Okay, in verse 16, now we get into a little problem. When Memucan replied to the presence of the king and the nobles, they weren't sure what to do. So the king has to ask his aides, what to do. So he spoke to the wise men. It says there in verse 13, he spoke to the wise men. And this Memucan was the one that spoke up. He replied to the presence of the king and the nobles. Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles of all the land of Medo-Persia. This very day, the Persian and Median women, you can close your ears now. This very day, the Median Persian women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles the same way. This will be no end to the disrespect and discord. If the queen can say no, then every woman can say no. And we can't have that. This is the exact response that they had, where Vashti thought that the king would sober up and realize what he had done wrong. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Median Persian Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti will never again enter the presence of King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. When the king's edict was proclaimed throughout all of this vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed, and he sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom. Remember, they had a very good postal system, each in their own script and each person in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his household. Later, when the king's anger had subsided, he remembered what Vashti had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's attendants proposed, we need a search. We need a search for a new, beautiful young virgin to be the next queen for the king. And so the letters went out again for the search for the king. Now, this was in the 3rd year of the reign of King Xerxes. Now there was in the citadel of Shusha a Jew by the name of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. The girl, who also had known as Esther, was lovely in form and features. And Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Esther was also taken into the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor immediately. He provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. This was kind of a tedious and long event. Before verse 12 in chapter 2. Before the girl's term came in the King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for women, 6 months with oils and myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Verse 16, she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, the 7th year of his reign. Now, he started out with this thing in the 3rd year of his reign. Now we're up to the 7th year. 4 years. Towards the end of the 7th year, the 10th month. Why did it take so long? Well, historians think that he was kind of busy at that time because he was invading Greece. And he had a few other things on his mind. Okay, so the king, we know the king chooses her. Verse 18, the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials, and he proclaimed holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Now, here's where the plot comes in. Every story has what they call a hook. Here's the hook. Verse 21, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, remember he was there almost every day, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, they would be sentinels, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officers were hanged on a gallows. And this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. The book is kept in the presence of the king. But evidently, somewhere along the line, the item that Mordecai had come across this story evidently never got transmitted to the king. Chapter 3, go to verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down and pay him honor, he was enraged. And having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing Mordecai only. Instead, Haman looked at a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So he has this plot. He's going to get them all. So he goes to talk to the king, verse 8, and Haman says to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If this pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out the business. Okay, and the footnote down there, it says 10,000 talents is about 375 ton. And I did the math, all right? I did it last night. Silver right now is down. The top silver sold for was about $49 an ounce in April of 2011. Now it's about 40% of that. It's trading for about $20 an ounce, just a little under $20 an ounce. But based on yesterday's close, 375 ton, 750,000 pounds, 16 ounces per pound, $20 per ounce comes to $240 million. So Haman says, I want to get rid of these people. And I will put $240 million worth of silver in the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. Anybody heard of a bounty? He was going to put $240 million in the treasury for a bounty for people to kill the Jews. But what does the king say? Keep your money and do with the people as you please. On the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned, and they wrote out the script, sent it out to each province in the language of each people so all could understand it, that this was to happen. And the date that it was coming down, they'd actually drew lots for the date before Haman ever went in to see the king. And the date was the 13th day of the 12th month of that year. Remember that date. Okay. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces in order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on the single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder all of their goods. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shusha was bewildered. Chapter 4. Mordecai learns of the plot. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he took his clothes off, and he tore his clothes, and he put on sackcloth and ashes. Now, I understand that in custom back there, especially like with the rabbis, with the leaders, you're only allowed to rent your clothes once. Anybody that's a little bit more scholarly than I am, is that true? I've heard that you're only allowed to do it once. But anyhow, he did it at this time. He went only as far as the king's gate, because you couldn't enter the king's gate if you were clothed with sackcloth. You weren't allowed to enter. The province went out, edict went out to every province. Esther's maids found out and told her that he was sitting at sackcloth and ashes. Esther sent clothes to him. He refused to put them on. Then Esther summoned one of the king's eunuchs to attend her and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. And Mordecai came back. He came back with the story. So the eunuch went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he will be put to death. The only exception for this is the king to extend his golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I have actually seen the king. So she was afraid to go. So then what does Mordecai do? He tells her, and this was our scripture for this morning, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Mordecai had the faith that the Jews would be saved. He's just not sure where it would come from. But you and your family will perish, him included. He was a cousin. But you and your family will perish, and who knows but what that you have come to a royal position for the time such as this. Esther sent the reply, go gather all the Jews that are in the citadel and in Susa, and fast and pray for 3 days, eat nor drink day nor night. At the end of the 3 days, Esther put on her royal clothes. She goes into the king's palace. She didn't even live in the same house that he did. And the king was sitting on his royal throne. We're in chapter 5 now. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out the golden scepter. And so Esther touched it. And he asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is it, your request? I will give you up to half of my kingdom. The kingdom must have been pretty big. She says, if it pleases the king, I only have one request. I would like you to come to a banquet right away today that I have prepared for you. Now, I think that we said earlier that they were known for their banquets, and I think that term was used rather loosely. So anyhow, We might say, come for lunch. But she says, come for a banquet that I have prepared for you. And bring Haman at once. So the king asked, so that we may do what Esther asked. So the king and Haman went to the banquet she had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked her, now what is your petition? Many times we've heard of people that answering a question with a question, but how about answering a banquet with another banquet? What is your question? And she says, tomorrow I'd like you and Haman to come back again to another banquet that we will have prepared for you, and then I will ask my question of you. So he asked them to come back tomorrow. So Haman went out very happy, high spirits. Of course, he was half drunk or maybe more. But when he saw Mordecai sitting there at the king's gate, he just burned with anger again. So Haman restrained himself and he went home. When he got home, he says this in verse 13, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. His wife has quite an answer. She says, well, why don't you build a gallows so you can hang him? Have a gallows built 75 feet high and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. Now, this was about 500 BC, so that's like 2,500 years ago. We had 1,260 years in the middle there that was called the Dark Ages. Then we kind of come out of that with the Renaissance at the end of it. And we think we're pretty technologically advanced right now, but we really aren't. Tom, could you build something that tall overnight? If you rented all of the scaffolding at Swanson Rental, would you dare put it up? Would you dare climb up 75 feet? No. If you got on the phone and called for a crane, he wouldn't get here overnight either because all the permits that would be required. But somehow they did. They built a 75-foot gallows overnight. And the other thing I read in preparing for this sermon is that he probably wasn't hanged, even though it says that, because they said that at that time, and you got to remember, it was even at Jesus' time, it was the thought to try and find as cruel a death as you could and put it on display for everybody to see so they would stay in line, so they didn't want to suffer these cruel deaths. And, the crucifixion where they put person up, they didn't even put them like this, they actually turned them halfway around. And you'd put the upper torso one way and the bottom torso the other. The Persians at that time evidently crucified by impaling people on a pole and then sticking them out for everybody to see. And of course, they wanted to go 75 feet in the air so everybody would see it. So this is what they suggested. This is what his wife suggested, and this is what he did. Now, nobody could sleep. The next morning, Haman obviously couldn't because he was going to try and go and get Mordecai the next morning. He was going to ask for him right that next morning, so he couldn't sleep. And the angel of the Lord allowed the king to have a restless night too. And he woke up early in the morning and he says, I should maybe go over the book of Annals, the Chronicles. So he had it brought in and he had it read to him. In there, as they were reading to him, he sees this story of the would-be assassins, the plan that was thwarted. And he sees that Mordecai is the person that had brought us to the attention of the security for these two men that were planning on killing him. About that time, the king hears somebody in the outer courts, and he says, "Who is that? Who's there?" And they said, "Well, that's Haman. Haman has just walked in." "Bring him in," the king ordered. Then Haman entered, and the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Oh, Haman thought, boy, this is me, All right, this is pretty good. Then Haman himself thought, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So, verse 7. So he answered the king, for the man the king delighteth to honor should have them bring a royal robe, one that the king has already worn, and a royal horse, one that the king has already ridden, and one with a royal crest placed on the head of the horse, and let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before them, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. King says, go at once. Get the whole robe, the horse, do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything that you have recommended. Could he be more embarrassed? Absolutely not. So the man that he wanted to kill, that he was coming to ask permission to hang him, now he has to put the king's robe on him, put him on the king's horse, special horse, and he has to lead that horse around through the town, telling everybody this is the person that the king wants to honor. The only little bit of satisfying grace that he had there was he was the noble one that was picked. That the king picked him to be the noble one to lead it on. Now, I'm pretty sure that trip around town was kind of short. I don't think they went too far. I would guess it was a short trip. After Mordecai returned to the king's gate after this, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. Now, there was two reasons that they covered their head. One was mourning and sorrow, and the other one is as you were facing execution. So he covered his head and he ran home. Well, his wife knew his goose was cooked. She says, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. He hadn't been home very long, and the king's eunuchs came back again and picked him up to take him back to the citadel for the second banquet. This time, I think Haman's a little bit more subdued. He went in to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on that second time, the king again asked, okay, Esther, what is it? What is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom will I give to you. And the queen answered this. She says, O king, have favor found with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people, for this is my request. For my people have been sold to destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If it were merely to be sold as slaves, I really wouldn't bother you. I wouldn't waste your time with this. But because of them wanting to kill all of us, I have to ask for you to intervene. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is it? Who is this man who has dared to do such a thing? And Esther replied, it's the adversary and eunuch, an enemy, this vile Haman. Well, immediately, the aides that were with the king went and covered his face, because they knew and he knew what was next. They knew he was going to get executed, so that's why he got covered up. That's the other reason you cover their head. So the king was furious. He went out. And I guess there was a little bit, I'm getting my things out of space. The king was furious. He went outside into the garden to walk around, cool off a little bit. When he came back in, here's Haman in a compromising position on the couch that Queen Esther is reclining on. Now he gets very upset, and he says, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in this house? And at that point, then the aides came and covered his head. Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, was one of them that went to pick him up earlier that morning. He said, he says, he's built a gallows 75 feet high right by his house. And he made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged him on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And of course, we all know that part of the story. We're not done yet. So the queen knows that we have to get this edict reversed. So she asks him in chapter 8, verses 11 through 14, she pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. They begged for him to put an end to the evil plan. Remember, this had already gone through because they had stamped it with the signet ring. And then the king extended the golden scepter, and Esther rose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks I do the right to do it, and if he pleases with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman has devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? The king replied with he would send out a new edict. Verse 11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. We take the right to assemble kind of almost for granted, don't we? There's a lot of places in the world right now where Seventh-day Adventists cannot assemble as we're assembling right here. The right to assemble should never be taken for granted. They had the right to protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nation or any province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this all in the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Remember, that was the day that they were supposed to be annihilated. A copy of the text of the edict will be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so the Jews would be ready on the day to avenge themselves of their enemies. The couriers riding on royal horses raced out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was also issued in the citadel of Shusha. And remember, they had a pretty good postal system, so they could get this information around to everybody else. Okay. I had a certain minister in my house last night, and he says, what are your 3 points for the sermon? Here they are. Esther, number 1. Esther is a story about what it's like to follow God in the real world. Just like Esther, number 2, just like Esther, God has a place, a situation, and a task for us. We need to commit ourselves to follow God, whatever the outcome. They're not all going to turn out as good as this one did, by any means. The story of Esther is how all the Jews were saved would not have been made possible had it not been for Mordecai's unwillingness to compromise. He would not bow down to a mere mortal. We need to have that uncompromising spirit too. Closing song is hymn number 196, Tell Me the Old, Old Story.